The first patrol car rolled onto the gravel road just after sunrise, its tires crunching slowly toward the old cedar farmhouse as red and blue lights flickered through the morning fog. Daniel Harper had already been outside for nearly an hour, replacing loose cedar boards along the same fence his late father had built almost 40 years earlier. He set down his hammer, pulled off his work gloves, and watched the deputies step out of the cruiser. Most people would have walked straight toward the patrol car demanding answers. Daniel didn't. Instead, his eyes drifted past the flashing lights to the narrow strip of ground running beside the fence. He stopped for a moment, studying the bare patch of dirt with a quiet look of concern. Something that had been there yesterday was gone. Deputy Collins opened his notebook. "Mr. Harper," he called, "we've received a complaint from your neighbor. He claims you've crossed the property line, removed survey markers, and damaged land that doesn't belong to you." Daniel never interrupted. He simply nodded, listening until the deputy finished. Then he asked one calm question. "Before we go any further, did either of you notice what's missing?" The deputies looked at each other. They hadn't come searching for something missing. They'd come expecting to investigate a straightforward property dispute. Across the fence, Richard Dawson stood quietly on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, watching the conversation through the thinning fog. For someone claiming his land had just been disturbed, he looked surprisingly patient. Around the valley, most people already believed his version of events. For weeks, he'd been telling anyone who would listen that Daniel had been moving the old fence a few inches at a time. Deputy Collins glanced from the complaint in his notebook to the empty patch of earth beside the fence. By sunset, no one in the valley would be arguing about Daniel Harper's fence anymore. They would all be wondering why an old iron survey marker had disappeared hours before the police ever arrived. Deputy Collins stepped closer to the fence and followed Daniel's gaze. At first, the bare patch of earth looked ordinary, but as he crouched beside it, the difference became obvious. The soil wasn't weathered like the rest of the fence line. Its edges were still crisp, as though something solid had been pulled straight out of the ground only a few hours earlier. "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked. Daniel pointed toward the empty hole. "There used to be an iron survey marker there. My father showed it to me when I was a boy. He always said, 'Never argue over a boundary when the land already knows where it is.'" Deputy Collins wrote the words down, then paused. Old family memories weren't evidence, but missing survey markers often were. Richard Dawson finally walked over from his porch, setting his coffee mug on the fence post. "Don't let him change the subject, Deputy," he said confidently. "He's had weeks to move that fence. Now the marker suddenly disappears. That isn't a coincidence." It sounded logical. In fact, it was exactly the kind of explanation most people would accept. Daniel never raised his voice. Instead, he looked directly at the deputy. "If I wanted to hide the marker," he asked quietly, "why would I be the one telling you it was missing?" The question hung in the cool morning air. Richard's calm expression shifted almost imperceptibly before he answered, but no words came. Deputy Collins slowly closed his notebook. For the first time since arriving, he looked less like an officer responding to a routine neighbor complaint and more like an investigator trying to understand what had already happened. He brushed away another layer of loose dirt around the empty hole. A perfect circle of rust still marked where the iron stake had rested for decades. Property lines don't disappear by themselves. Survey markers don't pull themselves out of the ground, which meant someone had been standing beside this fence long before the police ever arrived. Deputy Collins remained crouched beside the empty survey marker hole for another moment before brushing the dirt from his gloves. His eyes drifted along the aging fence line stretching across both properties. "Let's walk the boundary," he said. Neither man objected. The three moved slowly through the damp grass, stopping every few yards as the deputy studied each cedar post. Most leaned slightly with age, their surfaces faded to the same weathered gray after decades of sun, rain, and winter frost. Then, halfway down the fence, one post broke the pattern. Every other post had surrendered to time. One still carried the pale color of freshly cut cedar. Deputy Collins stopped. "When was this one replaced?" Daniel studied it for a moment before quietly shaking his head. "I didn't replace that post," Richard answered before Daniel had a chance to say anything else. "It was rotting. Somebody had to replace it." The deputy looked at him. "Do you have a receipt? A photo? Anything showing when the work was done?" For the first time that morning, Richard hesitated. "It was a few months ago. I don't keep records for every fence repair." It wasn't an unreasonable answer. Most rural landowners didn't. But it was the first answer Richard hadn't delivered with complete confidence. Deputy Collins walked around the post and pressed the toe of his boot into the loose soil surrounding its base. The ground gave way far more easily than it should have. "This dirt hasn't been here for months," he said quietly. Daniel said nothing. He'd spent enough years working the land to know that dirt was often more honest than people. His father had built that fence by hand. Richard knew that, which made the missing survey marker feel less like simple vandalism and more like something carefully planned. Deputy Collins photographed the fresh post, the disturbed soil, and the empty marker hole before pulling out his phone. "I need the county's original survey records," he said, "and I want the last inspection filed on this property, because if the county records still matched what Daniel remembered, someone's story was about to collapse." Deputy Collins slipped his phone back into his pocket. "The county survey technician is on his way," he said. "He found the original records." The words settled over the quiet fence line. Richard shifted his weight and glanced toward the road. "Do we really need to drag old paperwork into this?" he asked. "We're talking about one missing piece of iron." Deputy Collins met his eyes. It stopped being just a missing piece of iron the moment someone reported a property crime. Daniel said nothing. He remained beside the empty hole, his attention fixed on the disturbed patch of earth as though the ground still had something left to say. 20 minutes later, an aging county pickup rolled slowly onto the property. The survey technician climbed out, carrying a weathered leather tube beneath one arm. Years of fieldwork had faded both the leather and the man's hat to nearly the same shade of brown. Without a word, he spread a yellowed survey map across the hood of the patrol car. Richard stopped pretending to study the map. Instead, he watched the surveyor's face. The older man followed the faded property line with one finger. Once, then again. His movement slowed. He leaned closer to the brittle paper before quietly murmuring, "That's strange." Deputy Collins stepped beside him. "What is it?" The surveyor didn't answer. Instead, he rolled the map halfway closed and looked toward Daniel. "You've been staring at that same spot all morning," he said. "Why?" Daniel finally looked up. "Because that's where the truth used to be." The surveyor nodded once before walking to the empty hole. He studied the disturbed soil in complete silence. Nearly a minute passed. Then he stood. "Someone didn't just remove a survey marker." His eyes shifted briefly toward Richard. "Someone tried to erase where this property legally begins." Deputy Collins slowly closed his notebook. Because if the surveyor was right, they weren't investigating trespassing anymore. They were investigating evidence tampering. Deputy Collins reopened his notebook. Then, without taking his eyes off the empty survey marker hole, he spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, I'd like another unit at my location." Richard looked up immediately. "Another unit?" he asked. Collins answered in the same steady tone. "To preserve a potential crime scene." The words settled over the property like a sudden change in the weather. Until that moment, everyone had been treating the missing survey marker as part of a disagreement between neighbors. Now the patch of disturbed earth had become evidence. 15 minutes later, a second patrol car rolled onto the gravel drive carrying evidence flags and rolls of crime scene tape. Neighbors began gathering quietly along the county road. Nobody spoke above a whisper. In small rural communities, flashing lights always reached people before the facts did. The survey technician stretched his measuring tape between two original boundary markers that still stood untouched farther down the fence line. Every measurement matched the faded county survey within a matter of inches. Only one location refused to fit, the empty hole. He checked the distance once, then again. Finally, he lowered the tape. "The original marker belonged here," he said quietly. "There's no reasonable doubt." Richard folded his arms. "Maybe the old records are wrong." The survey technician slowly shook his head. "I've worked county surveys for 32 years. He tapped the weathered map. "Paper can be mistaken." Then he pointed toward the disturbed soil. "But this ground isn't." Daniel remained silent. He had learned long ago that truth didn't become stronger because someone argued louder. It became stronger when every piece of evidence quietly agreed. Deputy Collins slipped on a pair of evidence gloves and carefully brushed away another layer of loose dirt. His fingers suddenly stopped. He had felt metal, but it wasn't where the survey marker should have been. Deputy Collins looked toward the survey technician. "You're going to want to see this." Whatever was buried beneath that soil wasn't supposed to be there. Deputy Collins knelt beside the empty survey marker hole, careful not to disturb the soil any more than necessary. The survey technician joined him, using a small hand trowel to remove the loose dirt one thin layer at a time. For nearly a minute, neither man spoke. Everyone else simply watched. Slowly, a strip of rusted metal emerged from the earth. It wasn't the missing survey marker. It was a broken steel pry bar. Its tip was twisted sharply to one side, with damp soil still packed into the fresh bend. The survey technician examined it carefully before giving a slow nod. "That would do it." Deputy Collins looked up. "Do what?" "Pull an iron survey marker that's been buried for decades." The words settled heavily over the quiet property. Richard folded his arms. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. That tool could have been buried there years ago. The survey technician shook his head. If it had, the corrosion would be even. He pointed to the damaged tip. This happened recently. Deputy Collins photographed the pry bar before sealing it inside an evidence bag. Then he stood and slowly scanned the fence line again. Something still didn't fit. If someone had pulled the survey marker from the ground, they couldn't have carried it very far. The soil was too wet, too soft, too exposed. Fresh footprints or drag marks would have been obvious. His eyes moved across the property until they settled on an old weathered utility trailer beside Richard's equipment shed, 30 feet away. Close enough, dry underneath, the kind of place someone might hide something before daylight. Deputy Collins looked at the trailer, then back at the evidence bag, then toward the second deputy. His voice remained calm. "Don't touch that trailer." The deputy froze. Collins never looked away from it. "You might be standing next to the rest of this case." The second deputy froze where he stood. Deputy Collins walked slowly toward the weathered utility trailer, staying on the gravel instead of the damp ground surrounding it. "If there's evidence under there," he said quietly, "I don't want anyone disturbing it." Richard finally stepped forward. "That's my trailer." Collins met his eyes. "Then you won't mind if we look." For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The survey technician watched in silence. Daniel remained exactly where he had been all morning, beside the empty survey marker hole. One deputy knelt beside the trailer and aimed a flashlight underneath. Most of the ground beneath it was dry, except for one narrow strip of freshly disturbed soil near the rear axle. "There," Collins said. Using a small evidence trowel, the deputy carefully removed the loose dirt. Only a few inches below the surface, the corner of a heavy canvas bag appeared. Collins photographed it before lifting it free. The zipper resisted at first, stiff with dried mud. When it finally opened, there was only one object inside, an old iron survey marker. Its lower half was still coated with damp soil. The survey technician took a slow breath before measuring it against the original county survey. No one interrupted him. After nearly a minute, he looked up. "That's it." He rested one hand on the weathered iron. "This is the original boundary marker." Deputy Collins looked from the marker to Richard, then back toward the empty hole beside Daniel's fence. The property dispute was over. A criminal investigation had just begun. Collins reached for his radio. "Dispatch." He paused for just a moment. "Notify the sheriff. We're going to need a search warrant." The sheriff arrived less than 40 minutes later. He listened quietly as Deputy Collins explained everything they had found: the missing survey marker, the disturbed soil, the original county survey, the pry bar, and the iron marker recovered beneath Richard's utility trailer. When Collins finished, the sheriff turned toward Richard. "Mr. Dawson," he said evenly, "do we have your permission to search your workshop and equipment shed?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Search all of it." The answer caught everyone off guard. "If I've done nothing wrong," he added, "I've got nothing to hide." Deputy Collins exchanged a brief glance with the sheriff. Then the sheriff nodded. "Very well." 2 hours later, after the warrant had been signed and the search formally documented, the deputies began working through the shed one section at a time. Nothing dramatic appeared. Old tools, fence staples, receipts, weathered equipment. For a moment, Daniel quietly wondered if he had remembered everything correctly. Had the marker really been exactly where he believed? The survey technician noticed the concern on his face. "You've been looking at that spot all day," he said. Daniel nodded. "My father always told me that neighbors have to live beside each other long after the argument ends." He looked toward the old cedar fence. "That's why I wanted the truth, not another fight." The search continued. Inside a workbench drawer lay a small notebook filled with fence measurements, boundary sketches, dates, and supply lists. Nothing unusual, until Deputy Collins noticed that one page had been carefully torn out. A few minutes later, another deputy searched the burn barrel behind the shed. Among the cold ashes rested the missing page. Though partially burned, one hand-drawn sketch remained visible. It showed the original survey marker, an arrow pointing several feet away, and a single handwritten date matching the week before the police report. The sheriff studied the page in silence. Then he looked at Richard. "You have the right to remain silent." The sound of handcuffs echoed softly across the quiet valley. A week later, county crews returned the original survey marker to its rightful place. Daniel rested one hand on the weathered iron post his father had shown him decades earlier. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, looking across two farms that had never really changed. The line between those properties had never moved. Only the line between truth and accusation had. If you enjoyed unraveling this quiet mystery, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever seen patients uncover the truth better than an argument ever could, I'd love to hear your story.